InFamous is what I believe to be Sucker Punch's crown jewel. Some might say it's Ghost of Tsushima, some might even say it's Rocket Robot on Wheels if you're a hipster. I don't recall if they ever made anything else. Either way, for me it doesn't get any better than InFamous, with InFamous 2 in particular being one of my favorite games of all time. Few games have ever made me cry, and InFamous 2 didn't make me cry, but it came close. I'm not quite as keen on the first game. That game's great, but pretty rough around the edges when you're looking at it with hindsight. Can anybody say creepypasta Trish? InFamous is only a series of 3 games, technically 4 or 5 if you count Festival of Blood or First Light as standalone things, but even that was arguably too much. Because there's somewhat of a red-headed stepchild in this franchise in the form of Infamous Second Son. Which is not to say that it's bad, just that most people tend to deem it, if not inferior, at least an unnecessary sequel to the games that came before it. It has its fans absolutely, so I'm sure what I'm saying is sacrilege to some, but I'm not saying you can't like Second Son, nor am I dogging on it. It's a perfectly good game. I'm just expressing that some people, myself included, believe it didn't need to happen. And considering that it's in a different city with different characters and largely ignores the previous games, does kinda make it feel largely pointless. But it's still a very fun game to play, arguably even better than the previous games. I could neon dash around the city for hours, but the fact that it's so disconnected from the other games to the point of ignoring them does beg the question. Is it even canon? The obvious answer is, of course you fucksack, of course it's connected to the rest of the series. That was what it was intended to be. But what is intention in the face of contradiction? Irrelevant, that's what. Or is it? Here's the thing. There's no big series of reasons why Second Son could be considered non-canon. I don't have a checklist. It's really just one big overarching reason, and everything else sprouts from that. Said reason is that this game's mere existence contradicts the ending to Infamous 2. So I'm gonna spoil pretty much the entire series, including the ending to Infamous 2, and it's a great freaking game with an amazing ending, so if you haven't played it yet, do be sure to turn off this video now. I'm warning you. Last chance. Okay, so canonically this game follows on from the good ending to Infamous 2. If you didn't play Infamous 2 and didn't turn the video off when I told you to, your loss. But I guess for your sake I'll say what happened. So in the first game, Cole inadvertently activated what was called the Ray Sphere, which in short activates what's called the Conduit gene, giving him superpowers. But the Ray Sphere also released a buttload of what's called Rayfield radiation, which slowly but surely causes an unstoppable plague that threatens to wipe out humanity. A plague which only conduits themselves are immune from. The only thing that can stop it is the Rayfield inhibitor, or the RFI for short, which when used will neutralize Rayfield radiation the world over. However, using it will also kill every living conduit. So in the good ending at least, Cole nobly sacrifices his own life and the lives of all his brethren in order to ensure the survival of humanity and the eradication of the plague. That is, after only a couple people died from it, probably around 20 to 50 million people. So where does the contention lie when we take Second Son into account? During the ending in question, it's established that all living conduits were killed when the RFI was used, not just activated conduits. Even people overseas who had no idea that they had the conduit gene.
News said even some folks overseas were keeling over. Poor bastards must have been conduits and didn't even know it.
Basically, they leave no ambiguity as to whether or not any conduits survived at all. Knowing that, you may pop in Second Son and be expecting an explanation as to why conduits are still around after they've ostensibly and extensively been totally and absolutely killed off. As I did when I first played it, and like me, you may be perplexed because their explanation is... well, there is no explanation. It's basically hand-waved away with nary a thought to spare in literally the prologue splash page. The world-changing events of the previous game are only vaguely alluded to, and the earth-shatteringly large inconsistency of conduits still being around despite those events is a plot hole so inherent in the premise of Second Son that it's pretty much inseparable from the game. Which is why the question comes up, could Second Son even really be considered a canon entry to the series? The only real consequence that the previous game has on Infamous Second Son is that after the events of 2, the government has deemed conduits dangerous, leading them to lock up conduits without trial, calling them bioterrorists, which, by the way, isn't that a ripoff of like 17 different X-Men plots? Either way, there's no wiggle room that I can see as to whether this game could actually take place because of the finality of Infamous 2's good ending. I mean, what could they say? Maybe the conduit gene still exists in humanity and this is the next generation? While they specify that it's only been 7 years, so our boy Delson Rowe was definitely born before the events of the previous game, and so were all the other conduits in the game. That further brings up the issue of how these conduits had their powers activated. If hypothetically the events of InFamous 2 only killed activated conduits, how did unactivated conduits get their powers, considering that Cole needed an experimental device and the neuroelectric energy of several thousand people? If each of these people dealt with their own race sphere level event over the past 5 to 7 years, that's kind of a big deal to brush under the rug. And if there were more race sphere level events, wouldn't that just kickstart another plague? Unless each and every single one of these people had their powers activated the same way Quo did, but that's a can of worms in itself. Who would have been going around doing that? It's not a small procedure. You need an entire Walmart level company to fund that level of crazy experimentation, as well as what looks to be a pretty serious amount of space and energy per person. As a matter of fact, for the characters that were given a backstory, they don't even specify how they got their powers. Like Eugene, the nerd character who was bullied, and then his powers just happened. Or for the druggy character Abigail aka Fetch, whose powers also just happened when... nothing. They just happened on their own. There was no general explanation, at least not one that's in line with how anybody got their powers previously. With the exception of Augustine herself, who, get this, was visually established to have gotten her powers from the Beast. Which means she had to have gotten her powers before conduits were wiped out. Which only furthers the inherent plot hole in this entire game's premise. Delson is one of the most egregious examples of this because he didn't even know he was a conduit, but he, much like Rogue from X-Men, just gains people's powers and also memories when he touches them. Thinking about it, there could have been an explanation which might have been able to fit within the parameters of the story. That is to say, if this was all like 20 years later so that an entire generation would have passed, meaning that a new crop of people with the dormant conduit gene could have been born. And maybe the conduit gene is mutating, so it's activating on its own now. That would at least be something, and perhaps that is the explanation for how they got their powers consequence-free, but there's no evidence to suggest that is the explanation, and as I said, only 7 years have passed. So the fact that any of them are even still alive is impossible based on established events. So it's weird that they go out of their way to make a sequel to the previous game and yet are so keen to ignore their own established lore. Like a broken Beyblade, no matter how you spin it, it just kind of falls apart. Is there an explanation that exists to all of this? The possibility exists, but in the game, they just kind of brush past the point, hoping that nobody will notice, I suppose. If there is an explanation, the onus is on the game to tell us, not for us to assume, because when one is left to find their own answer to something like this, they're well within their rights to just assume there is no answer. Which is basically my mentality, and this is something that's a world-changing event, so it needs to have some level of concrete explanation for why everything is largely the same. Otherwise, it's just kind of intelligence insulting, because you expect the audience to just overlook the fact that we're going back to status quo after a status quo shattering event. No chance. It's not even just the death of the conduits. The Beast rampaged through half the country, killing probably tens of millions of people, and the plague itself killed millions more. After 7 years, that's still going to be a very significant topic, because you have the trillions of dollars of repair that need to take place and the collective trauma of hundreds of millions of people. Once again, this is not something that just goes away. This is not something you can just sweep under the rug. These are important things that never get addressed as if they didn't even happen, and this is a small point, but I find it worth noting that Second Son takes place in Seattle. Like, just plain old everyday Seattle. Where the previous two games took place in Empire City and New Moray respectively. Cities that were based off New York and New Orleans, but were very much fictional cities. So from a logical standpoint, why are we now in a situation where we're in a real-life city as opposed to a fictionalized version of same? Is this a matter of them not caring enough, or not paying close enough attention to maintain the consistency, or was this intentional in order to separate Second Son from the previous games by making it seem slightly less fictionalized? So that messes with the lore somewhat. Granted, InFamous has never been rock solid lore-wise. The ending to InFamous 1 was somewhat contradicted in InFamous 2, because when Kessler told Cole of the apocalyptic beast, Kessler omitted the fact that the beast wasn't the threat, it was the plague that was caused by race sphere radiation. The beast was merely a conduit that had the power to activate other conduits and was attempting to activate as many people as possible before the plague wiped out humanity, as conduits themselves were immune. You know, saving the world by any means necessary. As a matter of fact, Kessler spearheaded the Race Sphere project when he came back in time so he could get it to Cole much sooner. So if anything, Kessler is the one that caused this mess, and then there's also the matter of whether or not John White was the beast in Kessler's timeline. There's an entire theory based around the possibility of another person being the beast before Kessler manipulated the timeline, but those are the types of things where there's enough wiggle room that you can find your own explanation. I choose to believe that because Kessler spent so many years running from the beast, he never actually learned of the beast's true nature or intentions. So he saw it as nothing more than a monster and not merely a symptom of a larger problem. He probably thought the plague itself was a symptom of the beast. So when he went back in time, he didn't even realize that he was making the inevitable happen sooner. As for whether or not John White was the beast in the original timeline, well, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. There's evidence to suggest that either could be true. It doesn't matter though, because that timeline no longer exists, so there's no way to know, but also, it's not relevant to the current timeline. See, that's where ambiguity creates meaningful interpretation, but the ending to InFamous 2 has no ambiguity. It is wholly black and white. I have a theory, and it might be completely spurious, but it's something that I think about. I don't think that Sucker Punch was particularly enthused about making another InFamous game. I think it was a case of Sony needing more recognizable IPs on their new console early on to sell the thing, and so instructed Sucker Punch to make a new InFamous game for PS4. Because this entire game really does come across as the result of somebody being told to continue off a story that really didn't have a natural way to continue, ignoring or glossing over the previous games and telling a story that's smaller scale, completely separate from the previous games, and ultimately inconsequential. And even once you're beyond the inherent issues, they don't even do well with the plot threads they have. For instance, all the characters in InFamous 2 came across as real humans with flaws and weaknesses. Even Cole in his most evil form didn't seem straight up evil, merely a coward taking the easy way out. The characters in Second Son come across as so one-dimensional and stereotypical. The nerd, the druggie, the troubled kid, they're all so flimsy. Then there's the villain who's the most one-dimensional of them all. A completely reprehensible conduit who's sinister and evil beyond comprehension. Where previous villains had layers, this woman is as layered as a blank sheet of paper. To call Augustine cartoonishly evil gives cartoons a bad name. And the writing is atrocious in a lot of cases. Like the relationship between Delsin and his brother Reggie. Reggie is wholly against the conduit thing for most of the game, actively staying uninvolved as much as he could. Then he just out of nowhere decides to start supporting Delsin by putting himself in danger, and he flips back and forth between supporting the entire conduit cause and wanting to lock them up at a moment's notice. It's to the point where the brotherly relationship is so poorly written and inconsistent, I couldn't help but laugh at Reggie's unceremonious and completely emotionally disconnected death. Like, it wasn't built to, and their relationship was so inconsistent and poorly written that it felt cold and almost laughable when they tried to tug at your heartstrings at a character who had more heel and face turns than the Big Show. And the fact that they had the balls to reuse the "I love you brother" line at the end in regards to Reggie was insulting. Everything I've brought up, I can't envision a scenario where the same things weren't brought up in a boardroom somewhere. This is a company that's not shy about abandoning their old IP once they're done with it. And this is a company that traditionally has an insanely high quality standard of writing, so seeing how vast the gulf is between Second Son and even their previous game really strikes me as jarring. Short of severe indifference, having a mass exodus, or incredible publisher interference, you really don't get that level of sudden drop-off. So really, it just strikes me as less of a game they wanted to make and more of a contractual obligation that they didn't really know what to do with. They weren't quite prepared to risk making a new IP, but InFamous, despite being finished, was the biggest string to their bow at the time. So having this game that plays well but is ultimately as pointless as an appendix really does make you wonder. But then again, maybe I'm just projecting. Maybe this is something that they collectively agreed needed to happen because they were briefly taken over by body snatchers. I guess the question still remains though, is InFamous Second Son canon to the larger InFamous series? Well, despite everything I've said, that's not for me to decide. For me personally, the answer is absolutely not, because not only does it not make sense when you look at what's established in one game versus what's established in Second Son, it actively undoes a lot of the good that InFamous 2 does. But here's the twist, me buccos. There's no authority on what is and isn't canon, it's all down to personal discretion really. I mean yeah, an official source might theoretically have more authority than your average Joe Schmo because they're deeper down the rabbit hole than most people and have power over the events of the thing in question, but when it comes to fiction, nobody has an authority over your interpretation. It's yours to make and yours to believe in. There is no correct interpretation of any artistic work, not even the interpretation of the creators themselves. So while I can't speak objectively on this matter, I believe what I choose to believe. And what I choose to believe is that Second Son is a bizarre what-if story. And as a whole, I think if InFamous is never seen again, it would be a lot better off if we just ignored Second Son. Which is a damn shame because it's a really fun game to play. As a matter of fact, when I was playing through it for this video, I was lamenting the fact that this game was so poorly written because I was having so much fun with the moment-to-moment gameplay. I said it already, but it bears repeating. This feels like a true escalation of the concept in the gameplay area, but feels like such a drastic step back everywhere else. But I guess since the question is probably going to come up, if I were on the writing staff and were in charge of creating a follow-up to InFamous 2, what would be my ideal sequel? I think that's the million-dollar question, because how do you follow up on something like InFamous 2 without completely nullifying the sacrifice? Well, my first thought is you want to get some Bertrand-level private military contractor to dig up Cole's sarcophagus from the bottom of the ocean and use his DNA to clone an army of conduits, kind of continuing off of Bertrand's story from InFamous 2. But then one of these clones becomes self-aware and attempt to take the whole operation down, probably with the help of Zeke, joining the fight reluctantly in memory of his friend. I would have the main character's arc surrounding the idea that he wants to live up to the name of his DNA brother, but will never be Cole. Then the larger theming of the story would surround the idea of existentialism and the purpose behind life, because life has no meaning but the meaning that we give it, even if you're a clone. So that's my 2 cents on the whole topic. Am I right? Am I wrong? Let me know in the comment section below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Also bell icon. You know the drill by now. Then if you want to support my YouTube channel in a more direct way, please consider pledging to my Patreon like these fine folks right here. And also a special thanks to user Inutsu for going above and beyond. I've been the King of Snark Style representing Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!